All right, so we are back, and with any luck, we can maybe finish the Berkeley before next time. Okay, questions so far? Okay, so thus far it's just been Berkeley is upset about abstract ideas, but now he's going to give you his more positive view. All right, so he starts right at the beginning. He says, well, what are the things that we get to know about? He says, first, we can learn about various ideas. We can learn about, from sight, we can learn about light and colors, all the particular colors. From touch, we learn that certain things are hard, certain things are soft, certain things are hot and cold. We can feel motion, say, across our skin. We can feel the resistance of something. I guess Locke would call that solidity. And then so on and so forth for all the other sites. And then he also says we can know about collections of ideas. And for examples here, he gives apple, stone, tree, and book. And notice already, right at the beginning, Berkeley is assuming that an apple is a collection of ideas, right? So that is Berkeley's position. What does that mean? We'll kind of see as we go along. But yeah, so he starts out, and Berkeley's worldview is that there's not stuff that exists out in the world that's independent of your mind. Everything that exists only in your mind or somebody else's mind, right? So things can exist in people's minds, but things that exist outside of people's minds, Berkeley is going to think that's absurd. He's going to think that's a type of abstract idea, a thing that exists that nobody else is thinking about is going to be an abstract idea for Berkeley. And he's going to argue that those things don't exist. Things only exist in the mind. So what is an apple? What is a table? Clearly tables exist. Here's one. Okay. But the only things that exist are ideas or collections of ideas. Therefore, this table is a collection of ideas. It's the feeling that I have when I hit it, that feeling of resistance, that's an idea because it's a feeling and it's the feeling that I feel. It's the color that I see when I look at it. Well, that's that thing that's in my mind. The colors are in my mind, not in some outside thing in the world. So every aspect of the table is a thing that exists in my mind, in my experience of the table. And there is no further thing. There's no thing outside of me, right? This is why Berkeley thinks his idealism can get him out of skepticism, right? What's the skepticism that we get that comes with like Cartesian or Lockean thinking? Well, we have this like veil of ideas where what I see directly are all my ideas. And what my question is do the ideas correspond to the world out there, right? Descartes says, I have all these ideas of having a body, but do I actually have a body, or am I just being deceived by an evil demon, or am I just in a dream or something like that, right? Whereas Berkeley is going to say, we don't have this worry about how is the world out here, and does it correspond with how it seems to me, because the world out here and the world how it seems to me are the same thing, right? How it seems to me is just what is real, right? So the world is the world as it seems to me, right? That's Berkeley's idea. It's important that Berkeley has a metaphysics where there are two things in existence. Instead of modes, he does say mode maybe once or twice, but normally he just talks about ideas because we're talking about mental modes because he thinks the only things that exist are ideas and then the things that have the ideas. So the things that have the ideas are, he identifies, it just says that they're all the same, whatever you want to call it. A mind is the same as a spirit, is the same as a soul. It is the same as who you are, yourself. So Berkeley thinks that there are substances, mental substances, and that they are not ideas. So there's separate things, ideas on the one hand, and then things that have ideas. And he gives, I'm often going to, for Berkeley, have these little arguments up here. Berkeley is like the master of giving like a million arguments. So like every other paragraph, there's an argument. And so here in section 2, right, the second paragraph, minds perceive and are not themselves perceived. The existence of an idea consists in being perceived. There's a quote, whenever there's quotes, but I don't put where it's, because I put it at the top. So minds must not be ideas, right? So there's two types of things in the world. There's minds and ideas, and nothing else. That's his picture. And Berkeley's slogan is a Latin slogan, esse est percipi. Esse is the infinitive version of the to be verb. So in English, the correct translation would be to be. And then est is the same verb, but is just conjugated. So is. And then percipi, Latin has these passive voice infinitives. So that means to be perceived. So to be is to be perceived. That means for a table to exist, it's for somebody to see it, to smell it, to taste it, to touch it. That's what it is. To be perceived. And if the table is not perceived, then it isn't. So if everybody in the classroom closes their eyes, turns their backs to the table goes away, right? To be is to be perceived. Actually, Berkeley's ultimate view is not that the table goes away because he thinks God is always there looking at everything, right? But just in general, to get the idea, before we stick God in there, like if we all wanted the table to go away, all we'd have to do is stop paying attention to it and thinking about it, and it would go away, right? So Berkeley puts, so he's got this Galilean view of the secondary qualities, but he also has the view of the primary qualities, but we'll get there. So he says, there was an odor, that is, it was smelled. There was a sound, that's to say, it was heard. There was a color, a figure, or that is, it was perceived by touch. That is all I can understand by these and the like expressions. So Berkeley doesn't understand what it would mean for there to be a sound of a tree in the forest, falling in the forest, with no one around to perceive it, because what is there to be a sound? There's a sound that is to say it was heard. There's only a sound if there's something in your mind that is the sound. So Berkeley is definitely not on Locke's side of the tree falling in the forest picture of things. Right? Sensible things are ideas. Sensible things. So like by sensible, Berkeley means like you can sense it, you can touch it, you can smell it, you can taste it, you can lick it, whatever. Right? So tables are ideas. What's the argument? Well, Berkeley's got an argument for us. He says, well, things like houses are sensible. I think I picked the choice here of a house, not Berkeley, but houses are sensible. What are sensible things? Sensible things are things that can be sensed. They can be smelled, they can be tasted, they can be touched. What are the senses? Seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, and so forth. What do you see? You see sights. And for Berkeley, that's an idea, right? You see like a color. What's a color? It's an idea, right? You hear sounds. What's a sound? It's an idea. You smell smells. What's a smell? A smell is an idea, right? So all of these things are ideas. And so so the sensible things are made out of, right? The things that you can sense, right? When I sense the house, what am I sensing? I'm sensing ideas. So sensible things are ideas, right? So that's Berkeley's. If you feel like there's some sliding here and he's little cheating on language, I think that's true, right? There is kind of a cheat, but Berkeley would say that other people are cheating, right? He's just got his vision and he says, well, look, the things that you can sense are ideas. And so if you can sense a house, then a house must be an idea, right? What else would it mean for a house to exist? Like you sense the house, well, the things that you sense are ideas, so it must be the case that the house is an idea or a collection of ideas, right? So that's Berkeley's idea. Well, it's always tough to talk about these things because you want to use idea in the regular sense of idea, but also, so Berkeley's picture is that The world is made out of ideas. It's all in the head. It's not in, there's not a separate world that things exist in, right? So Berkeley thinks in particular that there aren't any abstract ideas, right? We saw his diatribe in the introduction against abstract ideas. And then he gives some arguments about why you can't, you might think, okay, I get that you can't see an abstract idea, but can't you think of it in your mind? And Berkeley says, no, because thinking of a thing is having an idea in your mind. So Berkeley thinks imagining and seeing are basically the same thing. You have to get later than even the part that I assigned for Berkeley, where he tries to distinguish the two. But as an idealist, you have a little bit of a problem. And your problem is to distinguish. If you think that tables are only in the mind, there's no real world table, there's only my experiences of a thing, then you might say there can't possibly be a difference between the Michael who hallucinates a table, who's standing over here and hallucinates a table that he's knocking on and licking or whatever, and the Michael who's really standing with a real table that exists out in the world and also in his mind. There's no difference between hallucination and the real world. So Berkeley has a bit of a story to tell us about how that works, how we could distinguish hallucination and the real world. Every idealist is going to have this problem because they say there's no real world, and they're going to have to draw a distinction between ideas that are real and ideas that are imaginary. And there's a sort of problem that you can have as an idealist, right? But Berkeley is going to think that basically imagining and perceiving are the same type of thing. And then he's just going to have to tell a story as to why sometimes we call it imagining and why sometimes we call it perceiving. So he thinks, in particular, abstract ideas, you can't think about them. Yeah, obviously you can't see them because you've never seen an abstract man, like a man who's not a particular height. But you also can't think about them, right? Okay. Here, though, I think Berkeley has this idea as well, where he thinks of unperceived objects, like a real physical world that exists independent of people thinking about it and looking at it, are kind of just like abstract ideas. There are these absurdities, right? So he doesn't explicitly say this argument in the previous, where I give this argument. So you can only imagine things that in principle can be perceived. You cannot in principle perceive abstract ideas, therefore you can't imagine abstract ideas. I think Berkeley has this argument comes up a little bit throughout, where he thinks you can only imagine things that in principle you could perceive or see. And you can't imagine unperceived objects, right? So Berkeley says, close your eyes, imagine a tree in a forest with no one around to see it. Aha, I got you. You didn't do that. What you imagined is a tree in the forest, and who's seeing it? You're seeing it. You're seeing it in your imagination, because seeing and perceiving are all the same, right? To have an idea is all one as to perceive, right? So if you try to imagine a thing like imagine a table that nobody is currently looking at or touching or tasting or smelling or whatever. Berkeley says that's impossible, because if you've successfully imagined a table, you're the one seeing the table, right? There's a perception right there in your mind. So Berkeley thinks unperceived objects are just as absurd as abstract ideas. You can't imagine an idea that nobody is having, right? You can't imagine a table that nobody is seeing, because what are tables? They're collections of ideas. And there must be a mind that has that collection of ideas. So if you're thinking of a table, somebody is seeing that table, and that's you, right? So you can't imagine unperceived objects. So Berkeley is going to think this whole world of physical stuff and particles and all these things that Newton is always talking about and he's so famous for, these things don't exist, right? They actually don't make any sense, and we can't even coherently think about them. Right? When we try to think about an external world that exists mind independently, all we wind up doing is thinking of a world that depends on our own mind, right? We're always stuck within our own heads in that way. So Berkeley says the mind, so I'm skipping ahead just to give, this is later from section 23, but the mind taking no notice of itself is deluded to think it can and doth conceive bodies existing unthought of or without the mind, though they are at the same time, they are apprehended by or exist in itself, right? So what's Berkeley's solution to if a tree is in a forest? Wait, okay, give me one more slide, sorry. This is a famous quote from Berkeley in section 6. He says, all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, that's just a fancy way to say all the stuff, right? All the stuff that you know about. In a world, all those bodies that compose the mighty frame of the world, all the stuff, have not any subsistence without a mind, that their being is to be perceived or known. Nothing exists except that it exists in someone's mind. That consequently, so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind, or that of any other created spirit, they must either have no existence at all. So if I'm not thinking about it, and you're not thinking about it, and no other created person is thinking about it, then it either doesn't exist, or it exists only in the mind of maybe a non-created spirit. Maybe trees still exist when no humans around to think about them, because God still perceives them. Just putting that out there, I guess he's doing, right? But later he's going to have that view. So what's Berkeley's view on this question? If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to see it, no one's around to hear it, no one's around to smell it or taste it, there are no minds in the vicinity, what's the solution to the problem? Does it make a sound or does it not make a sound? Trick question. There are no trees and forests when there aren't any people around to see the trees in the forest, right? So if there's a tree in a forest and no one's around to see it, that's absurd, right? If someone's around, the tree only exists if somebody is around to see the tree, right? So Berkeley's solution to the problem, there are no such forests with trees that have unperceived objects in them. So what's the only substance in the world? Obviously, Berkeley is going to have to say mind is the only substance. There's no physical substance. There's no extended substance, because what properties would it have? I mean, we can't even think about such a thing, right? And so he has this argument that goes something like this. Suppose you have a thing that's red, Berkeley is like, or any quality, right? So suppose you have a thing that's red. Red is an idea, and thus for red to be in X or for X to have red is for X to perceive red, right? So for something to be red, what's the sort of things that can be red? Well, the only things are minds. Because red is an idea and to be red is to have the idea. So the only things that are red are minds, right? This also sounds to me like a very bad linguistic slide. Like it is not the same. Berkeley seems to be conflating being red with seeing red. And that is his theory, but he's just trying to argue in ordinary language that it's true. I don't think the argument is super convincing in ordinary language, but Berkeley does think it is. So he thinks he's really clever for this sort of argument. So he says, if something is red, but red, so suppose that the door is brown, right? If the door itself is brown, and that means the brownness is in the door, but brownness is an idea that exists only in my head. Therefore, the door must be an idea that exists only in my head, right? So that's the picture, right? It seems like linguistic trickery. I think it is linguistic trickery, but that's the picture, right? So mind is the only substance. There's no physical substance out there. So Berkeley is concerned with this Lockean idea that there's stuff out there in the world, real stuff, physical stuff, corporeal stuff, and that our ideas are some sort of copy or resemblance of them. even if it's only a partial resemblance, right? It doesn't have the color in the world, but it still has the shape, size, and whatever. There's a partial resemblance between our idea, right? But then Berkeley says, well, look, either the things that our ideas are supposed to be copies of are, so we have our idea, and according to Locke, this is a copy of something else that it resembles, right? And that it represents because it resembles. So here's a question we can ask about the thing that the idea is supposed to be a copy of. Is that thing perceptible or is it not perceptible? Well, if the thing that the idea is a copy of is perceptible, then it must be an idea, because what do we see? What do we see directly? Ideas, right? What do I see? Colors. What are colors? Ideas. What do I smell? Smells. What are smells? Ideas, right? So if the things that my ideas are copies of are themselves perceptible, then they are the ideas themselves, right? So there's no physical world that's separate from us. But if they are not, then ideas can't be copies of them, because ideas are, for instance, perceptible and mind-dependent things, and they don't resemble things in the world that are not perceptible and not mind-dependent. So Berkeley thinks only ideas can resemble ideas, right? If your idea is going to represent something because it resembles it, what is going to resemble an idea? Well, it's going to have basic characteristics of an idea, like that it's mind-dependent and perceptible. But if you say that there's a world full of things that are not mind-dependent and not perceptible, then my ideas don't resemble those things at all, and thus my ideas don't represent them and are not copies of them. And so that's Berkeley's idea. He thinks only ideas resemble ideas, therefore our ideas are not some picture of an external world that exists without us, because our ideas couldn't possibly resemble some external world that exists without us, because our ideas aren't external and they aren't non-ideas, and the only thing that they resemble are things that are mind-dependent and colored and smelled and tasty and whatnot. Cool. Sorry, looking for, okay, still got some time to go along. Corporeal substance, the stuff out there in the world, is nonsense, right? So stuff that's supposed to exist, this part of, right, so on Locke's picture, we have these ideas, they partially resemble real stuff in the world, right? So let's think about the real stuff in the world that the ideas are supposed to resemble. It's stuff that has no primary qualities. There's no color in the real stuff. It's just particles arranged in a certain way. It's only how light bounces off them, stimulates my retina, and makes me experience colors, right? So corporeal substance with only primary qualities has no color, taste, texture, smell, has none of these secondary qualities. But Berkeley says you can't imagine something, like close your eyes and imagine something that has no color, texture, taste, or smell. Well, I think actually it's pretty easy to close your eyes and imagine something with no smell, right? But imagine something with none of these things, right? And in particular, like just as before, where it looked like, oh, maybe we can abstract the idea of green, but then what did I do? I stuck it in a green square and gave it a particular shape. So you can't actually abstract the idea of green from a thing that is green. Similarly, this representation, I didn't actually take the color out of the picture, right? Because this picture is colored. It's black and white, right? Those are colors as much as anything else, right? So, or maybe black's the absence of color or whatever. I'm not a color theorist, but so you can't actually imagine a picture of a world with no color. Like I changed the colors from, you know, these colors to black and white, but you can't actually have a picture with no colors in it, right? So Berkeley thinks that you can't imagine corporeal substance. It's impossible to think of stuff that exists outside of ourselves without color, taste, and so forth. Because close your eyes and try to imagine. It's not just that you can't imagine something that's unperceived, right? Which Berkeley thinks you can't do. But you can't imagine something that doesn't have these perceptible qualities within it. If you try to form a mental image in your head of a world, say, without color, all you succeed in doing is forming a mental image that has maybe black and white as the colors, right? But you can't get rid of your ideas are ideas of little colored pictures. Therefore, they can never get rid of those secondary qualities. And because your ideas always have those secondary qualities, there's no way to conceptualize a world of things that don't have the secondary qualities within them. Right? So you can't even conceive of corporeal substance. So the idea that there is matter that exists apart from us is an absurdity. Berkeley thinks that language has tricked people into this idea as much as it's tricked people into abstract ideas, right? He thinks everybody goes along and thinks that there's a real world out there that's separate from us. And Berkeley thinks that that's just incomprehensible to think that there's a real world out there. There's no way to think about this supposed real world. Right? Let's see. Oh, yeah. And so then Berkeley gets into, he wants to argue against the idea of primary qualities. So Locke seems to think that there's this strong distinction between the stuff that's out there in the world and also in the mind, like shape, size, color, and motion. And then there's the stuff that's only in the mind, right? Where, like the colors and tastes and whatnot. Berkeley, on the other hand, thinks that Locke makes a mistake. Actually, all the stuff is in the mind. And so he's going to argue that shape, size, color, and motion, or not color, shape, size, motion, and solidity are all things that exist only in the mind, right? So primary qualities, actually, the list of primary qualities is 0, and everything winds up being a secondary quality, right? But Berkeley wouldn't call them like that, because if you only have one type of quality, why would you call it a secondary quality? Blah, 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 right? So Locke, remember we talked about this last time, and I didn't make too much of it, but Locke gives this, when he defines primary qualities, he doesn't say they're the things that our ideas resemble in the external world where they're the same in the world. This is true of primary qualities, where in Locke's idea, your idea of a square, for instance, has a little square in it because it's a mental colored picture of a square, and then the world can have squares in it. So squares can exist in the world and they can exist in your ideas, whereas colors can only exist in your ideas and not in the world, right? But when Locke defines primary qualities, he says, this is the definition he gives, it's things that can survive division or any sort of punching or smacking or whatever you do to a thing, it still has its primary qualities. He says, take a grain of wheat, divide it into 2 parts. Each part still has solidity, extension, figure, and motion. Divide it again, and it retains the same qualities. But there's a way in which this isn't true, and it's obviously not true, right? It doesn't have the same shape, right? If I cut something in 2 parts, does it have the same figure? Not the same exact, it has some figure, right? And if I cut a thing in half, yeah, I guess it's odder to talk about mobility and whatnot in this case. But like, if you have a thing with a certain shape and you cut it in half, well, now you have a thing with a different shape. And if you cut it in half, now you have a thing with a different shape. So it's not true that particular shapes survive division. It's only having a shape in general that survives division, right? If I cut a square in half, then I have a thing that still has a shape. It's just not a square anymore. But then what does Berkeley say is, like, shape in general, well, that sounds suspiciously like an abstract idea, right? If all I'm saying is, oh, well, the primary qualities are the things that survive division, like shape. Well, it's not a particular shape that survives division. It's only shape in general that survives division. But Berkeley doesn't believe in shape in general because that's an abstract idea, right? So he thinks that if you really look at the primary qualities, there aren't any, right? There's nothing that you know, yeah. So nothing fits this Lockean definition of what a primary quality is. That's one of the types of arguments that Berkeley gives about primary qualities. But he also has these bucket style arguments that we'll get into in a moment, right? This one goes a bit back to the ancient Greeks and stuff. So it's not original with Berkeley, but he says number is relative. So number was one of those things that Locke was going to put as one of the primary qualities. Excuse me. But Berkeley says the same extension, that is a thing that's a certain size, can be 1, it could be 3, or it could be 36. And that depends on whether that thing we're calling is a yard, which is 3 feet, which is 36 inches, right? So one and the same thing could be 1, could be 3, or could be 36. So there's no sense to be made of like just things being a specific number in and of themselves. They're kind of a number from a perspective. And he also says, we say 1 book, 1 page, 1 line, although all these things are equally unities, though some contain several of the others, right? So I have a thing. Is it one thing? Well, in a way, yes, it's a book, 1 book. But is it multiple things? Yes, it's multiple pages. Is each page one thing? Yes, it's 1 page. But actually, is it multiple things? Well, it's multiple sentences on the page, multiple words, right? So there's no sense to be made of whether anything is one thing or multiple things. Number itself is relative. Anyways, there's that point. I think that's a weird ancient Greek argument that I've never really liked. But cool. Let's get back to the buckets. So remember we had Locke's bucket argument where he sticks one hand in the hot water and one hand in the cold water, and then he puts them both in the warm water. And the hand that was in the cold water now feels hot when it's in the room temperature water, and hand that was hot in the hot water now feels cold when it's in the room temperature water. And we have to say that this water can't be how it feels, right? The appearance can't be in the thing, because then this water would have to be both hot and cold. Right? And so that's the type of argument that Locke uses to show that hot and cold are secondary qualities, not primary qualities. But Berkeley says, hey, I got bucket arguments out the wazoo. I can give the same argument for other things. Let's talk about primary qualities like shape. Imagine people who have 2 angles on a thing. So I've made the people into, remember, Berkeley believes that the only substance is minds. So these are the mind or the soul or the spirit or whatever. And they've got 2 angles on the coin. This guy's looking directly down at the coin, and this guy's looking at the coin from an angle. The idea that this guy gets is of an oblong shape, and the idea that this guy gets is a circular shape. So it seems as though we've got a bucket argument going on. This guy has an idea, is the thing this way or is it this way, right? It can't be both ways. The shape can't be in the thing itself, because if the shape was in the thing itself, then the thing would be 2 contradictory shapes. Therefore, shape has to be a secondary quality. In the same way, in the bucket argument, cold and hot have to be secondary qualities, right? Berkeley gives another argument, like he's living before the times of like frames per second or whatever, but it seems to be something like this. You can read in section 14, see what he says, but he seems to think that motion, like the fastness, like speed, like whether something is going by fast or slow, has to do with the succession in our minds of ideas. And if it's packed with more ideas, then it seems to go by slower. If it's packed with fewer ideas, then it seems to go by faster. So it's basically your mind's frame per second rate. And so that speed is not a primary quality, but is rather dependent on the observer. It seems to be the argument. I don't know. You can read section 14 and see if that that's what you think is his argument there. So yeah, so we've got general arguments against primary qualities, like Locke's definition doesn't work. We've got bucket style arguments against primary qualities. And then Berkeley leans into material substance being something that sucks. So he's got several things that he says about this. He says, first of all, there's just this metaphor that metaphysicians are always using of substance. But what is substance? Well, in Latin, that means something that stands under, right? And what does a substance do? Well, it supports its attributes. But what does support mean? It means carries under. But standing and carrying are metaphors, right? That's not what Descartes means when he talks about a substance supporting its attributes, or at least not what he literally means. So all the metaphysicians really have to give us is a metaphor. And of course, this is always going to be true. All of our language for talking about things like minds and metaphysics and whatnot is borrowed from our physical language because that's how human beings start, with our physical stuff. But anyways, so Berkeley says, well, what does this metaphor really cash out into, right? Well, he says, where do we get this idea of substance from? And so first of all, he has this, he and Descartes would agree here, where we don't derive our idea of substance from experience, right? So all we experience is the color of the wax and the shape of the wax and the hardness of the wax. We don't experience the wax itself, right? And, but Berkeley goes further and he thinks Descartes gives us a reason to think that we don't derive our idea of substance from reason either. And this is because Berkeley says it's entirely possible that material substance doesn't exist. And we know that because I could enter my Cartesian skeptic state and I believe that I see a piece of wax that's a certain color, shape, and hardness. Obviously, I don't see its substance. I know that the color, shape, and hardness exist, or those ideas exist, but I can coherently think that the substance doesn't exist that supports them. And if that's possible, then it shows that as a matter of reason, I don't know that there must be a substance there. Therefore, we neither get our idea of material substance through reason nor through experience, so we don't have such an idea. Furthermore, okay, Berkeley says, imagine, you might think that material substance is just something that we posit because it makes the most sense of our ideas, right? We might say, well, look, when Michael comes over here and he sees this table, and then you come over here and then you see the table, and everybody else can go look in this direction and see the table. Isn't the best explanation like there's a thing that's outside of all of us and it's causing our ideas of the table, right? That would be the best explanation for why we have these ideas, right? And then Berkeley says, well, how could that possibly be the best explanation, right? What we don't understand is how can physical things cause ideas, right? It's the mind-body problem. We've got the physical things, and then somehow ideas, and then yada, yada, yada. What is the connection between the physical things and the ideas? Show me where in Newton's laws it says that if the physical things are this way, you have these ideas. It doesn't say anything like that, right? So how could it possibly be the best explanation when that best explanation that you're proposing, that there are physical things outside of us that cause our ideas, is an explanation that contains this unexplained body-mind causation? But if you get rid of the outside world and you think that the only things that exist are ideas, then you don't have a mind-body problem, right? Because bodies are just ideas, and the relation between the idea and the mind is just, well, the mind has the idea, right? So there is more to say about the Berkeley, which unfortunately I haven't got to. But next time we will talk about finish the Berkeley because I want to give you the picture, the overall picture of Berkeley.